Welcome to the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Today we're going to talk to two professors who are working on an interdisciplinary project. The project is called Sherman's March in America, Mapping Memory. Professor Ann Rubin is from the Department of History at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Professor Kelley Bell, who is an assistant professor in Visual Arts Department, also at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County.
Great to be here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
First, can you tell us a little bit about Sherman's March and how this project relates to that topic?
Sure. I'm a Civil War historian, and Sherman's March took place in the late part of the Civil War. In the fall of 1864, General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a Union general, a Northern general, had taken control of the city of Atlanta, and he decided to move his army from Atlanta to Savannah on the coast. So on November 15th, Sherman's army, which was about 60,000 men, marched out of Atlanta, heading towards Savannah, Georgia. They moved in 2 columns. They moved about 10 miles a day. And famously, Sherman had gone without supplies. He'd ordered his men to live off the country and to, quote, make Georgia howl. And that is basically what his men did. They went from town to town, house to house, plantation to plantation, taking food, burning down barns, burning cotton gins, often stealing from the African-American slaves who, on the one hand, Sherman's men were liberating, were freeing, but on the other hand, were often also mistreating. And they made their way, it took about 6 weeks altogether before they got to Savannah. What this project is part of a larger work that is exploring the way that Americans have remembered Sherman's March and Sherman's March's place in American culture. So looking at the march from a variety of perspectives, from white Southerners who lived through it, from African Americans' memories of it, looking at how Union veterans remembered the march, and also looking at its place in films like Gone with the Wind, for example, in novels, in music, in poetry. A really kaleidoscopic look at the way that Americans think about war in general and the Civil War in particular. What this piece is that I'm working on with Kelley and has been very generously supported by a grant from the American Council for Learned Societies, the ACLS, and also UMBC through the History Department and through UMBC's Imaging Research Center, is a way to bring some of this content online and make it available to the general public. And what I really wanted to do was make this something different from the usual history website. Those websites tend to be archival in nature. Lots of images, lots of documents, maybe some explanatory text. But what I wanted to do was to allow people to see these different stories and these different interpretations and to make the memories, in a sense, visible to people.
It probably would be very helpful to see an example of how this project is going to work on the web. So could you show us a clip?
Let me describe a little bit what the project looks like. When you first come into the project, you see a layer of maps. There's actually 5 different maps representing 5 different interpretations or 5 different themes, which are one that we call the Sherman map, which is just basically what happened, one that we call the civilians map, which is stories of Southern civilians and African Americans. We have the soldiers map, which is the stories of veterans on the march. We have a map about tourism, which goes from 19th century travel accounts all the way up through trips that I've taken through Georgia in the past couple of years. And then finally, we have a map of fictional landscapes, which tries to place fictional stories and literature. So, for example, Tara Plantation from Gone with the Wind is located on our fictional map. And what you can also see is we have a time slider, which allows you to trace the path of the march across all of these different maps through time, so that you can see where the armies were on every given day. Then what you would have is there are lots and lots of points marked, and these points are places where there's a story. So why don't we show you one of the stories, and I think the one that we should pick would be Milledgeville, Georgia, which was the state capital. And so this is a story of Milledgeville from the perspective of the soldiers.
The soldiers of Sherman's left wing marched into Milledgeville on November 22, 1864. Milledgeville, Georgia's state capital, had been nervously awaiting their arrival. Governor Joe Brown and the members of the state legislature had fled, fearing capture. The state prison had been emptied, with the inmates promising to fight for the Confederacy having been moved out of town as well. Civilians and former slaves remained, and the latter cheered the men marching down the street with flags flying and bands playing. Sherman used the governor's mansion as his headquarters, though it had been emptied of most of its furnishings before his arrival. Although the soldiers entered unopposed, events in Milledgeville took a turn for the worse. Sherman ordered the destruction of everything of military value. Soldiers blew up the state magazine, inadvertently damaging nearby churches, and burned the local arsenal. The prison burned also, though that fire was set by the prisoners themselves. The young soldiers, after weeks on the march, had a few days in town and took a holiday of mischief and mayhem.
You're arguing that Sherman's March still resonates with people today. So this is a project about the memory of Sherman's March, not actually the details, the factual details of the march.
Exactly.
So how do you think it resonates still today?
I think it still resonates today because what Sherman's March has become is the repository for a lot of white Southern anger and white Southern resentment about the results of the Civil War. And so everything bad that happened in the Civil War, it seems to all come down and be blamed on Sherman. Now, I'm not absolving Sherman and his men of responsibility. They did horrible things. They did terrible things. The march was destructive and devastating to the areas in which it passed. But at the same time, he's not to blame for everything that went wrong and the legacy of Reconstruction, and it's a much more nuanced and complicated story. And one way that I think Sherman's March resonates today, even indirectly, is a few weeks ago where we had the case of Joe Wilson, the South Carolina representative who yelled, "You lie," at Barack Obama. I think it's fascinating that Joe Wilson's district is exactly the part of South Carolina that Sherman's men marched through. And so I think that there's still some element of resentment of federal power and some element of perhaps resentment of African Americans who were freed by Sherman's March and, of course, by the Civil War that still lingers today.
That's an interesting way to look at history as far as something that still connects us to the past and our current experiences. I'm also interested, though, in the collaboration between you two. These are very different disciplines. Mm-hmm. Kelley, how did this come about, and what do you think you learned from each other?
Well, Dan Bailey of the IRC originally brought us together. I'm working in the visual arts department, but previous to that, actually, I was running my own graphic design business, and one of the things that I did was manufacture props for films. So if you'd like to imagine, I was sort of a graphic designer from the past. So say if someone needed a Harvard diploma, I'd be able to produce it. If someone needed a can label that looked like it was from 1956, I would be able to produce that. So it sort of began from there. I'm a very good forger, if you'd like to put it that way. So Dan saw this, and seeing that the concept that Anne had, dealt so much with maps. He really wanted someone who could kind of speak the visual language of maps and make a convincing facsimile of the documents that sort of tell each different story. The map itself is sort of a narrative. Mm-hmm. So what we really wanted to do was stylistically have a look for each map that is very distinct. Right. So in a way, the map also becomes part of the navigation, and also sort of sets a context for what we're seeing these movies in. Say, for example, the map for Sherman's History is it the original map?
It's not the actual map that Sherman carried with him, although we tried to use that. What it is it's an 1865 map that was published right after Sherman's March. So it's as close to a contemporary document as we could get.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, and then sort of when we had that as the master document that we were going to base all the other ones on, either designing from scratch or adapting maps that were pre-existing. Say, for another map, we took a map that was done by one of the soldiers on the march, this guy named Sneeden. And it's a really beautiful document. You know, it's done in, you know, watercolor. You know, the penmanship in it is absolutely gorgeous. But, it, you know, obviously all these maps at the time, I mean, there was no GPS, there was no really solid standard. So essentially we had to build all these maps based on historical information to sort of fit within sort of this common map that we had that was Sherman's map. So, so that was a large part of it, was reconstructing this stuff.
Jump in about one thing. I love the notion that Sherman didn't have a GPS, and that's become, in one sense, a kind of guiding idea for us. Because before, this also goes back to Kriste's earlier question about, I'm telling the story of the memory of the march rather than the story of the march. We know the basic contours of the march. And so what I didn't want to do was get into a kind of he said, she said, they said, which was which story is correct, which story is true. And I actually, when I went on my first trip through Georgia, I talked to, I didn't actually know Kelley at this point, but I talked to Dan Bailey from the IRC and I said, do I need to bring a GPS? I had a list of every historical marker related to Sherman's March. And then I thought, you know what? Sherman didn't have a GPS. And so it's not the actual coordinates that matter. It's more the sense of place and the metaphorical places in some cases that really matters.
So what did you learn from each other, though, from the disciplines that you bring to the project that you think were an advantage or maybe sometimes also a problem? And how did you have to work through these different perspectives?
Well, coming from a design background, you know, I'm sort of familiar with working with, you know, people who are not designers. I mean, that's the nature of my job. So communication, clear communication is really a big part of that. And I think the thing that we're extremely lucky about is Anne and I hit it off right away. So, you know, for me, usually, you know, when you're working with a client, it's a one-way conversation. You know, the client is telling you what their needs are, and you sort of provide what they need. Granted, you are the designer, so there are different ways of interpreting it. But, you know, there are certain, there are certain restrictions on what you can and can't do. Not restrictions, but, you know, parameters. With Anne, I mean, she basically just, you know, handed the whole thing to me and said, go. And so, you know, after our first meeting, I come in and I start talking about, oh, and we're gonna have these toy soldiers, and you know, we're gonna do shadow puppets, and we're gonna do all this stuff. And you must have thought I was insane.
I didn't, though, because what I really didn't, because what I wanted, because I knew that I didn't want a traditional history website, I wanted to see where this collaboration could go. And so I loved the idea of working with different styles and having a different visual look. The last thing I wanted was this to look like every other documentary. And I also knew I didn't want it to have lots of flames shooting out, which is usually what you see in Sherman documentaries. So I was happy to have somebody with all kinds of great ideas for visualizing it. What was challenging for me was learning how to write for a visual medium. I'm used to writing for paper, for words. And so the first few scripts that I wrote were all way too long and way too elaborate and way too complicated. And so that for me was the tougher part of the collaboration, was just learning how to pare everything back. And historians are not used to working with anybody. We're used to working by ourselves. And so I like the idea of collaboration and I like working with a team, but it's definitely a different kind of historical work than I'm accustomed to doing.
Was there ever a time, though, where you, for example, wanted to have something that you thought was inappropriate from a historian's perspective or a presentation perspective?
The Zora Fair short was really, I think, actually an excellent example of sort of this dialogue that we're talking about. because we had discussed blackface for a little while, and then, just sort of in the repository of ideas, I got the idea of sort of doing a cartoon that's very storybooky, because even though the story is based in fact, it does have sort of a legend type quality to it. So I did want it to sort of seem, this is the shadow puppet one that I was talking about. Shadows or silhouettes were really sort of, a common form of portraiture, back during that time. And also using silhouettes really sort of negated the question of race as a color.
Right.
So, that was one of the reasons that we sort of pulled it over in this direction. So, we sort of began with this premise, and it turned into sort of a full-fledged animated film. So, Anne had originally written the text, and, we started working with that. I did the storyboards, and we started going forward with it. And, as sure as anybody will tell you, animation takes a really long time. So, we're sort of chugging along, producing the animation, and sort of as we were getting deeper into, the production of this, I started thinking, well, maybe, is this right? Like, because there's some really heavy issues there. And, Anne has her vision, I have my vision, we're working together on this vision, and, we're thinking, oh, what could be wrong with this? So I decided to, show it to some people outside of the project, which I think we learned, is something you got to do.
Right.
Because, even though, okay, we're setting this up so it's in context, we understand that, this film is neither condoning nor opposing, what happened. When you take it out to the web, there is no context. Someone can just send a link and say, look at this crazy film I saw, isn't this terrible or isn't it wonderful? And that's really where you start to get into trouble. So I, showed this to people, and they were just like, whoa, you really want to, put this out there? And so, I came back to Anne and said, I've shown this to some people, they have some concerns, what do you think about this? And, we went back and we did edits, and, sort of worked the text into the images in such a way that there was a clear explanation of why we were portraying it this way, and sort of, providing more background for the story. So that's really where, writers and image makers can really come together. And it's these minute details that really kind of make all the difference.
It's really an element of, I had pared back too much, or I had pared back the wrong things. And so rewriting the text to make our position clear while still being able to tell the story, and toning down some of the language, changing some of the language. And it was a really valuable learning experience for us. And I think it's, then we went through the other scripts with an eye to some of these same issues, and I think really strengthened the other scripts as well. So,
well, I think this brings up the question then of audience. Who do you see as your audience? What audiences motivated you to want to do this? And why not just a traditional book? Why also add the web element?
In terms of my sense of audience for this, the Civil War is unusual in periods of American history in that it has a huge appeal to a general audience, a mass audience. There are millions and millions of Civil War buffs, people who just are really interested in the Civil War. It's their hobby, they read for pleasure. So I think some of what I'm trying to do is reach that market, because I do feel like a lot of the popular histories of the Civil War and popular histories of Sherman's March don't necessarily get into the subtleties of interpretation and of nuance and these issues of memory and the way that two people can look at the same event and come away from it completely differently, or experience the same event differently. So that's one piece of the audience I want to reach. The other piece is I do think there's an education component to this, or this would be useful in an educational setting, because again, it would help students come to see the same event from a range of different perspectives. Why not just a traditional book? I had worked on a digital project before in graduate school, and I liked doing it. I liked having this different kind of medium to get the same ideas across in. One thing that I feel very strongly about, and that works very well in line with the ACLS, the foundation that supported us so far, and the university, is that I do want this to be a free project. I'm not interested in charging for access. That's just not what I'm about.
Your mission.
That's not my mission. I'll sell my book, sure, but I want to have this as a free and open project because I want it to be accessible and to reach as many people as it possibly can.
So how about for you, Kelley?
Yeah, from what you were, just sort of going off from what you were saying, I mean, I think the one thing that, in working on the project we need to keep, in mind constantly is that thin line of edutainment. I hate that word. We want these films to be meaningful, and we want these films really to bring the content, across, in a new way. Not necessarily. Talking about sort of the Ken Burns kind of paradigm that's kind of become the standard for documentary film. In teaching video classes, you say make it look like Ken Burns. There's even like a Ken Burns effect, I think, right, on iMovie. Mm-hmm. So everybody knows what that is, and once that becomes something that everybody knows, the presentation sort of loses a little meaning because sort of immediately then when you're going into it, everybody's like, oh, I know what this is. Mm-hmm. This is a Ken Burns thing. Mm-hmm. So we really wanted to kind of stir that up a little bit. Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, what we have right now is just a proof of concept. It's 5 short films, mm-hmm, one for each map. But eventually, the idea for the project is to have dozens and dozens of these, whether it's a film, whether it's a slideshow, whether it's just a one pop-up screen, but to tell the stories of these places from different perspectives. So what I can't wait is for when we have the money to do all 5 Milledgeville films. Mm-hmm. And so you can have African Americans being really happy, mm-hmm, to see the soldiers coming into town, and counter that with white Southerners who are furious, mm-hmm, about the soldiers coming into town. And in fact, talk about things still resonating today. I took a tour of the building, the governor's mansion that Sherman used as his headquarters, and the curator who took me on the tour said, I keep a small picture of Sherman in the room. It's all furnished in period style. And he has a little bitty, about 3 inches portrait of Sherman, and he says, every once in a while, little old ladies see it, and then they get really, really mad. So it does still resonate, it does still matter, and it's exactly this idea of trying to get all these different perspectives across.
Ann and I took a trip to Savannah, mm-hmm, to go and shoot footage for another short. And this was for Ebenezer Creek, which was one of the marches, well, many low points, but I think a lower low point, right, than usual. It was this creek where slaves who were following the troop column were left behind by Sherman's men. So we went down there with a camera. It's in the middle of nowhere, literally. We just sort of followed this dirt track out. This was my first time in Georgia. So we were there by the creek side, and I'm shooting footage. And, it's very beautiful, very peaceful, and there were a couple people who were there, fishing and doing, just creek things. And one of the people came up to us and said, hey, what are you doing? And, we told him, what we were doing. And, he said, oh, well, if you wait, I have a boat, and I can take you to exactly where the crossing happened. So he took off, and we're waiting for him, and of course, sort of being a tech head, I was just like, is this really a good idea?
And me being a native New Yorker thinking, ordinarily I wouldn't do this, just get in a boat with a stranger, But then again, there's two of us, and he did give me his cell phone number. Anybody with a cell phone can't possibly do anything untoward. And so when he came back with the boat, I did make sure to leave his name and cell phone number in our rental car, just in case we never came back.
Yeah.
But it was amazing, and he took us out on this, it's basically a cypress swamp, and he took us out in it, and he showed us exactly where this was supposed to have happened, and we got beautiful footage, and it was just a really great experience.
Well, I think that raises another question, though, here, and that is the idea of because this is a mapping memory site, in a way you're mixing fiction and fact as far as trying to display what may be people's memory versus what is the historical facts of incidents. And how, when you present that to a general audience, are you planning on making those distinctions?
Well, I think that's why we have what we call the fact map, the Sherman map, which is the one based off of the 1865 map. So that's the map, that's the one that's supposed to tell the stories from the most objective viewpoint, which is essentially, here's what happened in this place. That would be the most, I guess, I don't want to say Ken Burnsian, but I guess the most basic documentary there. Although, in fact, the film that we have for that map, the Ebenezer Creek film, is very, very powerful because it's a very powerful incident. So I think that's what we're trying to get at is here's one level of the story. Here are the facts that we know and the facts that are not in dispute. And now let's look at the layers of interpretation and stories and legends and get at that. But exactly, I'm not interested in deciding, well, was Zora Fair really a true story? You know, what's important to me is the way the story is told and what is the deeper meaning behind that story. Why is this a story that keeps getting passed down while maybe other stories are not?
So what's next for Mapping Memory?
Well, we've got 2 more shorts to finish up, but we're really looking for a site launch, I believe, at the end of this year.
Definitely.
You know, I've been working with a great team of people at IRC, and we just got some wonderful materials from University of Texas that are images from the original storyboards from Gone with the Wind. Really, absolutely gorgeous, you know, gorgeous watercolors, really incredible. So we're going to be using these as material for another map. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be great.
Yeah, I think, and once we get the mini site finished and launch it, then we'll be starting to apply for larger grants. So if anyone out there is from the NEH, you'll be hearing from us and other places. And then I'm also still working away on the book version of this story, which I'm hoping to get a contract for at some point in the spring and have it come out sometime in the next few years, and plenty of time for the 150th anniversary of the March, which will be in November of 2014.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you very
interesting
much.
Project, and good luck.
All right, thanks.